A second finding is that adopted siblings, that is, two children who were adopted from different families and brought up together in the same family, so they share all of their parenting, by the time they're grown up, they are not similar at all. Two adoptive children growing up in the same family are no more similar than two people picked from the same population at random. Well, this suggests that children are not shaped by their parents. They're shaped in part, though only in part, by their genes, in part by their culture, both the surrounding culture of the country that they grow up in, but also the children's own culture, that is their peer group, and in part by chance, random effects on the expression of genes, random effects in the wiring of the brain in utero, random effects as you live your life. And so this research tells us that the environment is important, but that we should not equate the environment with the parents. There are other aspects of the environment besides parents. Okay, the fourth body of writing that I would like to share with you now is what does language reveal about human nature? And this is the topic of my most recent book, The Stuff of Thought. I'm going to talk about indirect speech as a window into our social relationships. Let me explain what I mean by indirect speech. Many of you have probably seen the movie Fargo, the American movie. Well, there's a scene in the movie where there is a criminal who is pulled over by a policeman, and because the car is missing its license plates, the policeman asks him to show his driver's license. He offers him his wallet with the license showing and a $50 bill sticking out a little bit. And he says to the officer, "I was thinking that maybe the best thing would be to take care of it here in Brainerd." Now, we all recognize that as a veiled bribe. That is, if I give you $50, will you let me go? And presumably the police officer recognizes that, the audience recognizes that, and so on. So this is a veiled bribe, and that is what linguists call an indirect speech act. And we do this all the time. For example, if you could pass the salt, that would be awesome. I'm not sure exactly how it translates into Portuguese, but I think it's probably similar. But if you think about that, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But we automatically interpret it as a polite request. Would you like to come up and see my etchings? Everyone recognizes that. It's almost a cliche, at least in America, as a sexual come-on or a sexual proposition. And anyone who has watched The Sopranos or The Godfather knows that if a local hood says to a store owner, "Nice store you got there, would be a real shame if something happened to it," everyone recognizes that as a veiled threat. So here's a puzzle for a psychologist. Why are bribes and requests and seductions and threats so often veiled when presumably both parties know exactly what they mean? And this is not just an academic question, but it has a lot of practical importance, such as in the language of diplomacy and politics, and in the prosecution of extortion, bribery, and sexual harassment, which are often made in veiled form rather than blurted out directly. Well, here's a theory that every time we use language, we're actually doing two things. First, we convey a particular content, the bribe, the command, the proposition, but at the same time, we negotiate the kind of social relationship we have with a person. The solution is you use language at two levels. The literal form signals the safest relationship between the speaker and the hearer. The speaker then assumes that the listener will read between the lines, will interpret what the speaker really meant to entertain a proposition that might be incompatible with that relationship. So let me give you an example. The simplest example is from politeness. What's going on when someone says, "If you could pass the salt, that would be awesome"? Well, the literal content doesn't make any sense. For one thing, it's an overstatement. I mean, wouldn't literally be awesome if someone just passed you the salt. But also, why are you pondering philosophical questions like what the world would be like if you had the salt right there at the dinner table. The listener thinks, well, the speaker probably hasn't lost their mind. Therefore, if he says that it would be good to have the salt, he's really asking me to pass him the salt. The overall effect is that the intended message, the imperative or the command, gets through, but without the presumption of dominance, without the speaker seeming to boss around the hearer as if the hearer was a servant or a slave or an underling. Now, dominance is one of the kinds of relationships that people worry about when they use language. But it's only one of three major kinds of relationship. The other two are communality, that is, share and share alike. And the third relationship type is reciprocity. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. The tit-for-tat exchange of favors that biologists call reciprocal altruism. And we humans can assume any of those three relationships. And it's crucial which one applies. Each one lays out rules of proper behavior in a situation. For example, you might go over to your husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend at a cocktail party and help yourself to a shrimp off their plate. But you wouldn't go up to your boss and help yourself to a shrimp off their plate, because what is possible in a relationship of communality is not possible in a relationship of dominance. Or another example, let's say that you were at a dinner party. Your friend had you over for a nice meal at his house, and at the end of the party, you pulled out your wallet and offered to pay the host for the food. Now, this would be very strange, because the idea behind a dinner party is communality, where everyone is supposed to share, rather than reciprocity, where there's an exchange. Now, those are cases where everyone knows what to do. But when relationships are ambiguous, a divergent understanding between the two people is very unpleasant. It leads to an emotion that we call awkwardness or embarrassment. For example, there can be awkward moments in a workplace when an employee or a student doesn't know whether to address a supervisor on a first-name basis, or whether they can invite them out after work for a beer. It's a well-known piece of advice that close friends should not engage in a business transaction, like one of them selling his car to the other. The very act of negotiating a price can put a strain on the friendship. Everyone knows that one shouldn't cross dominance and sex, as when a supervisor or a teacher solicits sex from an employee or a student. We call that sexual harassment. So how do people negotiate these difficult misunderstandings of relationship? I'll give you one example. This came from a magazine article that I read on how do you bribe your way into a restaurant if you have no reservation? And let's say you wanted to give money to the maitre d' to seat you immediately. Well, the problem there is another awkwardness situation, namely, ordinarily the maitre d' is in the relationship of authority or dominance. He seats people when he pleases. By offering him money, you are changing the relationship to reciprocity. You give him money, he's obligated to seat you right now. And here's one way you can analyze that situation. Imagine that you didn't have indirect speech. You had to say everything literally. What are your options in that situation? Where you could either offer a bribe in so many words, just say it, or you could not bribe at all. Well, what's the better thing to do? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends on what kind of maitre d' you're facing. A corrupt maitre d' or a scrupulous maitre d'. Now, a corrupt maitre d' could accept the bribe, show you to a quick table, which is a very high payoff, a big advantage. And because both of you are engaging in a reciprocity relationship, there is no awkwardness. On the other hand, you're facing the risk that if you have a scrupulous or honest maitre d', he would refuse the bribe, and in fact it would be a very awkward situation because he's continuing to wield dominance while you have offered reciprocity. And that's what gives rise to that uncomfortable feeling. On the other hand, if you didn't offer a bribe at all, you would accept the dominance relationship, but you'd be stuck with a long wait. Now let's consider what happens if you have a third possibility, namely an ambiguous bribe, like, I was hoping that maybe there'd be a cancellation. You say this as you hold out a $20 bill just in the periphery of vision. Well, in that ambiguous case, a corrupt maitre d' could smell the bribe behind the innuendo, and you'd get the very high payoff of a quick table. A scrupulous maitre d' could choose to ignore it, to let it pass, and the worst thing you'd get is the long wait. So you get the very high payoff of bribing a dishonest maitre d' with a relatively small cost of failing to bribe an honest maitre d', all combined in one option. And so that makes the ambiguous bribe, like, do you have a cancellation, the rational choice. So, with that kind of analysis, I think one can understand why people offer bribes and threats and polite requests and sexual seductions in this indirect form. And those are just some of the infinite number of questions that one can ask about language and human nature. Thank you very much.
Você acompanhou a última parte da palestra Linguagem, Mente e Natureza, com o psicólogo Steven Pinker. No próximo mês, acompanhe aqui, na URGS TV, mais um especial Fronteiras do Pensamento. Obrigada pela companhia e até a próxima!